The morning mist clung to the red earth like a burial shroud as Colonel David D. Lones peered through his binoculars across the demilitarized zone. It was January 20th, 1968, and something deadly was stirring in the jungle beyond Sanh combat base. The silence felt wrong to complete, to deliberate, like the held breath before a scream. 6,000 United States Marines occupied this remote outpost in Quang Tri Province, positioned just 14 miles south of the DMZ and 6 miles east of the Laotian border. What had begun as a simple fire base to monitor North Vietnamese infiltration routes had transformed into something far more significant. General Vo Nguyen Giap, the architect of France's defeat at Dien Bien Phu, was massing an estimated 40,000 troops in the surrounding hills, turning Khe Sanh into what would become the longest and most brutal siege of the Vietnam War. The base sprawled across a plateau roughly 1,600 meters long and 800 meters wide, its red laterite runway cutting through the center like a scar, surrounded by rolling hills and dense jungle. The Marines had carved out defensive positions that bristled with sandbags, barbed wire, and mortars. The 9th Marines held the main base, while smaller detachments occupied Hill 881 South, Hill 861, and Hill 558 high ground that would prove crucial in the coming battle. Colonel Lones understood the strategic importance of his position. Khe Sanh controlled Route 9, the only major east-west road in northern South Vietnam, and served as a launching point for covert operations into Laos. More importantly, it represented American resolve in a war that was increasingly unpopular back home. President Lyndon Johnson had become obsessed with holding Khe Sanh, haunted by memories of the French disaster at Dien Bien Phu 14 years earlier. The first warning signs had appeared in late 1967, when reconnaissance patrols began encountering larger North Vietnamese forces. By January, intelligence reports indicated massive troop buildups in the surrounding mountains. The enemy had spent months positioning artillery, mortars, and rocket launchers in caves and bunkers carved into the hillsides. Supply trails snaked down from North Vietnam, carrying ammunition, food, and reinforcements for what promised to be a prolonged siege. According to detailed accounts in The End of the Line, the Siege of Khe Sanh by Robert Pizer, these preparations represented one of the most sophisticated military operations mounted by North Vietnamese forces during the entire war. Captain Mirza Beg, commanding Bravo Company of the 1st Battalion, 26th Marines, noticed the change immediately. His patrols reported fresh tracks, abandoned campsites still warm with cooking fires, and the distinctive smell of Nuoc MAM fish sauce that indicated recent enemy presence. The jungle seemed to pulse with hidden watchers, and his Marines began jumping at every sound. Staff Sergeant James Thomas McBreen, a veteran of 2 previous Vietnam tours, gathered his squad leaders around a crude map sketched in the dirt. Something big is coming, he warned them, his weathered face grave in the flickering light of a kerosene lantern. The Gooks are moving heavy stuff up their artillery pieces, mortars, probably rockets. This ain't gonna be no hit-and-run operation. The Marines prepared for siege warfare, a concept foreign to most American forces in Vietnam who were accustomed to search and destroy, missions and helicopter mobility. They reinforced bunkers, stockpiled ammunition, and dug deeper foxholes in the iron-hard earth. Medical corpsmen established 8 stations while engineers worked frantically to improve the runway and defensive positions. On the evening of January 20th, as purple shadows crept across the plateau, Colonel Lones received final intelligence estimates that chilled him to the bone. Satellite reconnaissance and radio intercepts confirmed the presence of at least 2 North Vietnamese divisions in the immediate area, with more forces moving south along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. General Giap was preparing to recreate his greatest triumph, using the same tactics that had destroyed French forces at Dien Bien Phu. The trap was closing around Khe Sanh, and 6,000 Marines found themselves standing at the center of what would become a 7 to 7 day nightmare that would test their courage, endurance, and will to survive against overwhelming odds. At 5:30 in the morning on January 21st, 1968, the earth exploded around Khe Sanh combat base. The first round screamed without warning 130mm field guns, 82mm mortars, and Katyusha rockets that lit the pre-dawn darkness with deadly orange flowers. Lance Corporal Michael O'Brien, pulling guard duty at the perimeter, the face first into his foxhole and shrapnel whistled overhead like angry hornets. The initial barrage targeted the main ammunition dump, a catastrophic direct hit that sent flames and secondary explosions towering into the sky. The blast wave knocked Marines flat 100 meters away, and the fireball could be seen from 20 miles distant. In those first terrible minutes, Sanh lost 90% of its artillery ammunition reserves, crippling the base's ability to return effective fire. Corporal Robert Martinez, a forward observer with the 13th Marines Artillery Battery, felt the concussion lift him bodily from his bunker. When he regained consciousness, his ears were bleeding and the landscape around him had transformed into a moonscape of smoking craters. The carefully constructed defensive positions had been shattered in the opening moments, forcing Marines to improvise new fighting positions while under continuous bombardment. Colonel Lones rushed to his command bunker, a reinforced structure built partially underground and protected by layers of sandbags and steel planking. Inside, RADIO operators struggled to maintain communications with outline positions while staff officers plotted the incoming fire on acetate-covered maps. The colonel's first priority was calling for immediate air support and resupply without constant aerial reinforcement. Sanh would fall within days. The opening artillery barrage continued for 2 hours, with rounds falling at a rate of 1 every 15 seconds. North Vietnamese gunners, safely positioned in caves and bunkers carved into the surrounding hillsides, had spent months registering their weapons on every significant target within the base. They possessed detailed maps showing the location of fuel dumps, command posts, medical facilities, and troop concentrations. Sergeant William Dabney, commanding my company on Hill 881 South, watched the main base disappear in smoke and flame from his elevated position. His hilltop outpost housed 100 Marines who served as forward observers, an early warning for the main garrison below. Through his field glasses, he could see North Vietnamese soldiers moving through the tree line, preparing for what appeared to be a ground assault. The siege had begun exactly as General Giap intended. By isolating Sanh with sustained artillery fire, he could prevent aerial resupply while his infantry divisions maneuvered into assault positions. The North Vietnamese commander had studied the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu extensively, learning from both French mistakes and Viet Minh successes. This time, however, he faced United States Marines rather than colonial troops, an American air power that dwarfed anything available to the French. Captain Kenneth Pipes, commanding Alpha Company of the 1st Battalion, 26th Marines, led his men in desperate efforts to restore defensive positions shattered by the bombardment. Working under intermittent shell fire, Marines filled sandbags, strung new communication wire, and evacuated wounded comrades to aid stations that were themselves under constant threat. The red dust of Sanh mixed with blood to create a crimson mud that would become the signature of this terrible siege. By noon, the first casualty reports reached Colonel Lone's command bunker. 18 Marines killed, 4 to 7 wounded in the opening barrage alone, with medical corpsmen overwhelmed by the severity and number of injuries. Hospital Corpsman 2nd Class David Steinberg worked frantically in the main aid station, performing emergency surgery under conditions that would challenge a peacetime hospital, let alone a bunker under artillery fire.
The Marines quickly learned that survival at Sanh meant adapting to a subterranean existence. Surface movement during daylight hours invited immediate death from sniper fire or mortar rounds. Troops moved through interconnected trenches and tunnels, emerging only when necessary to man fighting positions or conduct essential maintenance on weapons and equipment. As evening fell on January 21st, purple flares began falling over the base North Vietnamese signals for night operations. Colonel Lones knew this was only the beginning. Intelligence estimates indicated that General Giap had positioned enough artillery around Sanh to maintain this level of bombardment for months, slowly grinding down American resistance through constant attrition while preparing for a final, overwhelming ground assault. Dawn broke grey and ominous over Hill 861 on January 23, 1968, as Captain William Dabney watched North Vietnamese soldiers emerge from the jungle, mist like phantoms, materializing from nightmare. 3 battalions of the 325th North Vietnamese Army Division had spent the night positioning themselves for assault, their movements masked by the continuous artillery barrage pounding the main base below. Echo Company, 2nd Battalion, 26th Marines held Hill 861 with just 250 men, making them outnumbered more than 4 to 1. Staff Sergeant James Kaler moved among his squad positions, checking ammunition counts and whispering final encouragement to Marines who barely looked old enough to shave, let alone face what was coming up that slope. The attack began at 6:15 with a concentrated mortar barrage that transformed the hilltop into a cauldron of exploding steel and flying earth. Corporal Dennis Mannion pressed himself against the bottom of his foxhole, as rounds detonated so close he could feel the heat through his flak jacket. When the barrage lifted, he raised his head to see North Vietnamese infantry charging up the steep slopes in human waves. There are K-47 assault rifles chattering death. The Marines opened fire with everything they possessed: M60 machine rifles, M60 machine guns, M79 grenade launchers, and mortar that had somehow survived the initial bombardment. The slopes of 861 became a killing field, as interlocking fields of fire caught the attacking infantry in a web of bullets that mowed them down in wind. Yet still they came, stepping over their fallen comrades with a determination that both impressed and terrified the defending Americans. Lance Corporal Thomas Brindley, operating an M60 machine gun from a reinforced position, fired burst onto burst until his barrel glowed red-hot and began to warp. His assistant gunner, Private First Class Michael Coonan, fed belt after belt of ammunition while ducking the constant stream of bullets snapping overhead. The machine gun position became a magnet for enemy fire, with rifle grenades and rockets impacting all around their sandbagged emplacement. Captain Dabney coordinated the defense from his command post, a reinforced bunker near the center of the hilltop perimeter. Radio reports flooded in from squad leaders positioned around the defensive line, taking heavy casualties on the south slope. Need immediate medical evacuation. Running low on 40mm grenades. The young officer struggled to maintain command and control, while North Vietnamese rounds sought his position with deadly persistence. Hospital Corpsman First Class David Roberts crawled from foxhole to foxhole under withering fire, treating wounded Marines where they lay and organizing evacuation to the aid station established in a reinforced bunker. The corpsman had seen action in previous firefights, but nothing had prepared him for the sustained intensity of this assault. Wounded Marines continued fighting from their positions rather than abandon their comrades, refusing evacuation until physically unable to hold their weapons. The first assault wave broke against the Marine defensive line at 8:30, leaving dozens of North Vietnamese bodies scattered across the slopes. But Radio Hanoi had committed to taking Hill 861 regardless of cost, and fresh battalions immediately prepared for renewed attacks. During brief lulls in the fighting, Marines could hear enemy commanders shouting orders and the metallic sounds of weapons being reloaded in the jungle below. Ammunition began running critically low by mid-morning, forcing squad leaders to redistribute rounds from wounded Marines to those still capable of fighting. Sergeant Kaler made the dangerous journey from position to position, carrying bandoliers of M16 ammunition and boxes of machine gun belts, while enemy snipers tried to pick him off. The veteran non-commissioned officer had survived 2 previous tours in Vietnam, but he told his radio operator that 861 was shaping up to be the fight of his life. Air support arrived at 10-40-5 in the form of Marine F-4 Phantom, jets screaming in low over the hilltop to drop napalm and 500-pound bombs on the North Vietnamese assembly areas. The strike aircraft faced intense anti-aircraft fire from weapons positioned throughout the surrounding hills, but their intervention broke up the second assault wave before it could fully develop. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the battlefield, both sides settled into a deadly pattern of probe and counterattack that would characterize the fighting for Hill 8 the Marines had held, but at terrible cost, 43 killed and wounded in the first day alone, with no relief in sight. Major General Norman Anderson stood before a wall-sized map at Dong Ha Combat Base, studying the red pins marking North Vietnamese positions around Khe Sanh with the intensity of a chess master analyzing a complex endgame. It was February 1st, 1968, and the siege had entered its second week with no sign of lessening pressure. The Marine General faced a logistical nightmare that would have challenged Alexander the Great, keeping 6,000 besieged Marines supplied with ammunition, food, medical supplies, and water, while North Vietnamese gunners controlled every approach to the base. Operation Niagara, the massive air campaign supporting Khe Sanh, had evolved into the most concentrated bombing effort of the Vietnam War. B-52 Stratofortresses flew around-the-clock missions from bases in Guam and Thailand, dropping hundreds of tons of high explosives on suspected enemy positions. The giant bombers created a protective barrier around the base, with arc-light strikes falling so close that Marines could feel the earth shake from impacts just outside their perimeter. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Hageman, commanding the 1st Marine Aircraft Wing's helicopter operations, briefed his pilots on the morning's resupply mission with characteristic bluntness. Gentlemen, Khe Sanh is surrounded by more anti-aircraft weapons than downtown Hanoi. Every approach is covered by automatic weapons, mortars, and rockets. Some of you won't be coming back, but those Marines are counting on us. The assembled pilots, Marine Army, and Air Force crews flying everything from CH-46C Knights to massive CH-53C Stallions listened with the grim attention of men who understood their mortality. Chief Warrant Officer James Graham piloted his U-34 helicopter through the morning mist, following a zigzag course designed to confuse enemy gunners waiting in the hills around Khe Sanh. His aircraft carried critical medical supplies and mail from home, luxuries that meant the difference between hope and despair for Marines enduring their second week under siege. Graham had flown this route 17 times since the siege began, surviving by varying his approach pattern and trusting in speed, surprise, and divine intervention. The landing zone at Khe Sanh resembled a moonscape of overlapping shell craters and twisted metal debris. Wrecked aircraft lined the runway, testament to the accuracy of North Vietnamese gunners who had turned aerial resupply into a deadly lottery. Each helicopter had perhaps 60 seconds on the ground before enemy mortar bracketed the landing zone, forcing crews to unload cargo and evacuate wounded with desperate haste. Sergeant Major James Santoli supervised cargo unloading operations from a reinforced bunker near the runway, coordinating between air crews and ground personnel through hand signals and shouted commands that barely carried over the constant background noise of explosions. The senior enlisted Marine had developed an almost supernatural ability to predict incoming mortar rounds, diving for cover seconds before impacts that would have killed less experienced personnel. According to extensive documentation in Khe Sanh, Siege in the Clouds, by Colonel Robert Pizer, the aerial resupply operation represented one of the most dangerous and sustained helicopter operations in military history. Captain Michael O'Connor, commanding the base's air control team, watched North Vietnamese tracers reaching up toward an incoming CH-46 like deadly fireflies as the helicopter approached through a gauntlet of ground fire. The Sea Knight took multiple hits but continued its approach, finally settling heavily onto the runway with smoke pouring from its engine compartment. Ground crews rushed forward to unload ammunition pallets, while medics helped wounded Marines aboard for evacuation to rear area hospitals.
The psychological impact of successful resupply flights extended far beyond their material contribution to the base's defense. Each helicopter that landed safely represented proof that Khe Sanh had not been abandoned, that the outside world still cared about the Marines trapped on that isolated plateau. Mail call became a sacred ritual, with letters from home read and reread until they fell apart, providing spiritual sustenance as important as food or ammunition. While it complicated every aspect of aerial operations around Khe Sanh, the northeast monsoon brought low-hanging clouds, driving rain, and fog that reduced visibility to zero for hours at a time. Pilots attempting instrument approaches through multiple layers of clouds faced the additional challenge of anti-aircraft fire that could appear without warning from any direction. Many missions were scrubbed due to weather, leaving Marines on the ground to ration their remaining supplies in hope for clearer skies tomorrow. By February's end, aerial resupply operations had delivered over 4,000 tons of supplies to Khe Sanh, while evacuating more than 800 wounded Marines. But the cost had been severe: 35 aircraft destroyed and hundreds of aircrew casualties. February 15, 1968, found Corporal Danny Wilson crouched in a bunker so deep underground that he hadn't seen sunlight. In 6 days, the Marine combat engineer had become part of Khe Sanh's most secretive defenders, tunnel rats, who fought a shadow war in the maze of bunkers, trenches, and underground passages that honeycombed the base like a subterranean city. Above ground, North Vietnamese artillery continued its relentless pounding, but below the surface, a different kind of warfare raged in claustrophobic darkness. The bunker system at Khe Sanh had evolved far beyond original defensive plans, growing organically as Marines dug deeper to escape the constant shelling. What began as simple foxholes had become an interconnected network of tunnels linking command posts, ammunition storage, medical facilities, and living quarters. Some passages ran 15 feet underground, reinforced with steel planking scavenged from destroyed aircraft, and sandbags filled with Khe Sanh's iron-hard red earth. Sergeant First Class Robert McLean led a squad of specialists trained in underground warfare, men who volunteered for the most dangerous and psychologically demanding job on the base. These Marines crawled through narrow passages barely wide enough for human bodies, listening for the telltale sounds of enemy tunneling operations. North Vietnamese sappers were attempting to dig beneath the American perimeter, planning to detonate massive explosives directly under key defensive positions. The underground war required unique skills and nerves of steel. Armed with pistols, knives, and small explosive charges, tunnel fighters engaged enemies in hand-to-hand combat within spaces so cramped that conventional weapons became useless. Corporal Wilson carried a .45 caliber pistol, a bayonet, and a small flashlight with red lens to preserve night vision during underground patrols that could last 8 hours or more. Lance Corporal Timothy McNeil, barely 19 years old, discovered his first enemy tunnel on February 10th while expanding the communications trench near the southern perimeter. The young Marine noticed loose dirt that didn't match surrounding soil and detected the faint smell of cigarette smoke filtering up from below. His report triggered an immediate response from McLean's tunnel team, who confirmed North Vietnamese digging operations less than 20 feet from a Marine ammunition bunker. The counter-mining operation that followed exemplified the deadly chess game played beneath Sang's surface. Marine engineers used sensitive listening devices to track enemy tunneling while planning their own shaft to intercept the North Vietnamese passage. Working in 4-hour shifts, volunteers dug silently through rock-hard earth while others stood guard against possible enemy breakthrough attempts from unexpected directions. Hospital Corpsman Second Class James Patterson faced unique challenges treating casualties in the underground environment. Wounded Marines brought up from tunnel fighting often suffered from concussion injuries, severe lacerations, and psychological trauma that conventional battlefield medicine hadn't prepared him to address. The corpsman established an underground aid station in a reinforced bunker where he could treat patients without exposing them to surface bombardment. Communications presented constant problems. In the tunnel system, with conventional radios blocked by earth and rock, Marines developed an elaborate system of sound signals using metal pipes and wooden blocks to transmit messages through the underground network. Sergeant McLean's team used a code based on Morse patterns that allowed complex tactical information to be passed silently through the bunker system. The psychological strain of underground warfare affected even veteran Marines who had survived multiple combat tours. Fighting in total darkness within spaces barely large enough for human movement created a unique form of combat stress that medics termed tunnel syndrome. Men who functioned normally above ground became paralyzed with claustrophobia when forced to operate in the confined spaces beneath Sanh. Captain Robert Sterling, the base engineer officer, coordinated tunnel defense operations from a command bunker located 30 feet underground. His map showed a spider web of passages beneath the base, some controlled by Marines, others by North Vietnamese forces, and many disputed territories where deadly encounters occurred daily. The captain estimated that enemy sappers had dug more than 2 miles of tunnels in the hills surrounding Sanh, creating a three-dimensional battlefield that extended both above and below ground. By late February, the underground war had claimed 43 Marine casualties, but it had also prevented several catastrophic explosions that could have crippled Sang's defense. The tunnel rats fought their shadow war in complete anonymity, unsung heroes whose actions remained classified long after the siege ended. The dawn of March 6, 1968, brought no relief to the exhausted Marines of Sanh, now enduring their 45th day under siege. Colonel David Lone studied the latest casualty reports in his underground command bunker, the paper trembling slightly in his hands, not from fear, but from the accumulated stress of commanding 6,000 men through the longest sustained battle in Marine Corps' history. The numbers told a grim story: 468 killed and wounded, with combat effectiveness declining daily as exhaustion and psychological strain pushed his defenders toward their breaking point. Staff Sergeant William Dabney, commanding my company on Hill 881 South, exemplified the toll extracted by weeks of continuous combat. He, veteran Marine, had lost 30 pounds, his uniform hung loose on his frame, and his eyes held the 1,000-yard stare common among men who had seen too much death. His hilltop position had been attacked 17 times since the siege began, with North Vietnamese forces pressing closer to his perimeter during each assault. The Marines' defensive positions had been reduced to elaborate shell holes connected by trenches that zigzagged across the plateau like scars on wounded flesh. Above-ground structures had long since been destroyed by artillery fire, forcing defenders to operate from bunkers that resembled prehistoric caves. More than military fortifications, the red dust of Sanh had penetrated everything: weapons, food, clothing, and the very souls of men who had breathed it for more than 6 weeks. Captain Kenneth Pipes led Alpha Company in what had become a daily ritual: of repairing defensive positions shattered by nighttime bombardments. His Marines worked like automatons, filling sandbags and restringing barbed wire with mechanical precision born of desperate necessity. Conversation had largely ceased. There was nothing left to say that hadn't been said, nothing left to hope for except survival until the next dawn. Hospital Corpsman First Class Michael Roberts treated cases that defied conventional military medicine, Marines suffering from severe malnutrition, chronic diarrhea, and infections that wouldn't heal in the contaminated environment of the base. But it was the psychological casualties that concerned him most. Men who sat motionless for hours, staring at nothing, their minds retreating into protective shells that external stimuli could no longer penetrate. The siege had evolved into a test of pure endurance, with both sides grinding toward exhaustion through attrition that neither could sustain indefinitely. Intelligence reports indicated that North Vietnamese forces surrounding Khe Sanh had also suffered severe casualties, with entire battalions reduced to company strength through constant exposure to American bombing. General Giap's grand strategy was consuming his army almost as rapidly as it was destroying the Marine garrison. Lance Corporal Robert Martinez, forward observer for the 13th Marines, had developed an almost supernatural ability to detect incoming artillery rounds by their sound alone. His warnings had saved countless lives during the siege, but the strain of constant vigilance had pushed him to the edge of psychological collapse. Marines throughout the base exhibited similar symptoms: hypervigilance, explosive tempers, and an inability to sleep even during brief lulls in the bombardment. Historical records from the Marine Corps' History Division document that March 6th represented the lowest point in Marine morale during the entire siege, with several units reporting combat effectiveness below 50%. Colonel Lones faced an impossible decision as he reviewed intelligence estimates indicating that North Vietnamese forces were preparing for a final, massive assault designed to overrun Khe Sanh before American reinforcements could break the siege. His Marines had fought with extraordinary courage and determination, but human endurance had limits, and those limits were rapidly approaching. The colonel's request for immediate reinforcement had been approved by higher headquarters, but relief forces were still days away from reaching Khe Sanh. Sergeant Major James Santoli made his evening rounds through the bunker system, checking on squad leaders and assessing the mood of Marines who had become his extended family. During the siege, the senior enlisted Marine observed subtle changes that officers might miss: the way young privates avoided eye contact, the increasing frequency of minor disciplinary problems, and the dangerous fatalism creeping into conversations about home and family. As night fell over Khe Sanh on March 6th, purple flares began falling again over the base. North Vietnamese signals indicating major operations. But this time, the Marines barely reacted to what had become a nightly ritual of terror. They had reached the breaking point where survival became purely instinctive and conscious thought focused only on making it through the next few hours of darkness. April 1st, 1968, marked the 71st day of siege when Colonel Bruce Myers, commanding the 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, led the 1st Relief Column through the gate of Khe Sanh Combat Base. Behind him stretched a long convoy of trucks carrying ammunition, food, medical supplies, and most importantly fresh troops to replace Marines who had endured more than 10 weeks of continuous combat. The relieving forces found a base that resembled photographs of World War I battlefields, cratered and scarred beyond recognition. Operation Niagara Falls, the breakout operation, had begun on March 30th with coordinated attacks by 3 Marine battalions, advancing along Route 9 from the east, while heliborne forces landed in the hills west of Khe Sanh to cut North Vietnamese escape routes. The two-pronged assault caught General Giap's forces in the midst of their own withdrawal, as the North Vietnamese commander had already decided that Khe Sanh could not be taken at acceptable cost. Colonel David Lone stood at the base's shattered main gate to greet the relief force, his appearance shocking Marines who remembered the confident officer who had assumed command just months earlier. 7 to 7 days of siege warfare had aged him decades. His hair had gone completely gray, his uniform hung loose on his diminished frame, and his eyes held the hollow stare of men who had stared along into the abyss of modern warfare. The statistics of the siege told a story written in blood and courage that would become legendary in Marine Corps history. Of the 6,000 Marines who had defended Khe Sanh, 730 had been killed or wounded during 7 to 7 days of continuous combat. North Vietnamese casualties were estimated at 15,000, though exact figures would never be confirmed. More than 100,000 tons of bombs had been dropped in the hills around Khe Sanh. making it the most concentrated bombing campaign in the history of warfare. Staff Sergeant William Dabney led his surviving Marines down from Hill 881 south on April 2nd, carrying their wounded and their dead with equal reverence. My company had held their hilltop position through 37 separate attacks, never yielding a single yard of ground to overwhelming enemy forces. Of the 250 Marines who had climbed that hill in January, only 97 remained combat effective when relief finally arrived. The evacuation of Sanh began immediately after the siege was lifted, as military planners had already decided that the base served no further strategic purpose. The irony was not lost on Marines who had sacrificed so much to hold ground that would be abandoned within weeks of their victory. But the true purpose of Sanh had never been territorial. It had been to demonstrate American resolve and to bleed North Vietnamese forces at a rate they could not sustain. Captain Michael O'Connor supervised the removal of classified equipment and sensitive documents from the base, working alongside Marines who showed little emotion at leaving the place that had been their home and their hell for more than 2 months. The exhausted defenders displayed the same mechanical efficiency that had characterized their defense, performing necessary tasks without celebration or complaint. Hospital Corpsman David Roberts accompanied the last helicopter evacuation, caring for Marines too wounded to walk, but too proud to be carried. Many of the psychological casualties would require months or years of treatment, suffering from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. The corpsman understood that the siege of Sanh would continue to claim casualties. Long after the last artillery round had been fired, the siege officially ended on April 8, 1968, when the last Marine units departed Sanh combat base. Within hours, demolition teams destroyed the runway and remaining installations to prevent their use by North Vietnamese forces. The red earth of Sanh returned to jungle silence, marked only by countless craters and the unmarked graves of men who had died far from home. General William Westmoreland declared Sanh a decisive victory, pointing to the massive North Vietnamese casualties and the successful defense of the base against overwhelming odds. But the Marines who had endured the siege understood a different truth. They had fought and died, not for tactical advantage, but for each other, displaying the brotherhood and sacrifice that defines their corps in war's darkest hours. The siege of Sanh entered military history as testament to Marine courage under impossible circumstances, a 7-to-7-day demonstration that ordinary men could achieve extraordinary things when fighting for their brothers beside them.